This week, we are moving on to our third theme from our simple outline, and that is the M, and that's magnify the Lord. And it's the very first thing that Jesus tells us to say in Luke 11:2, when he answers his disciple, "When you pray, say, 'Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name.'" It means to declare God's name as holy and sacred. We are to lift the name of the Lord on high. We are to glorify his name. We are to magnify his name. And his praise should be continually on our lips, which is what we're told in Hebrews 13:15, which says, "Therefore, by him," and that's speaking of Jesus, "let us continually offer the sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name." Continually, always. And one of the times that we might find this most powerful in prayer is when we face a giant. So I had a giant just storm my world in the form of a phone call that left me completely overwhelmed and in so much fear. Someone close to me had made a decision, and it left me feeling threatened and vulnerable and insecure and really panicked. And I just lay flat on my face in prayer, attempting to hand it over to the Lord. I knew the situation was out of my hands and it was really in the hands of someone else, and I did not trust them to do the right thing. And so for quite some time, I really wrestled to trust God. And the more I thought about the situation, the more anxious and uneasy I became. My thoughts ran away to all of the worst case scenarios, which is easy to do, as I attempted to come up with some way that I could create control over the situation in my own mind, because I wanted to regain security and peace of mind. The more I imagined the potential fallout, the bigger the problem loomed, and the more helpless and afraid I felt. And in this, I learned a really profound lesson, and that is our main idea. This is the one thing I want you to remember today, if you don't remember anything else. What we magnify gets bigger. So it's like a magnifying glass. Whatever we get close to, right? We take that magnifying glass and we get really close to that thing. And when we examine it up close, it appears larger. The closer we get, the larger it appears. So if we zoom in on our fears and our problems and everything that looks impossible, these things will become like giants in our way. And when a giant storms our world, fear and doubt often emerge, maybe even despair. We may want to turn tail and run. So my first instinct is always flight. You know how they talk about fight or flight? I'm all about flight. Either I'll go away or you go away, or just somehow, some way make this problem just go away. So when life confronts us with impossible people and circumstances and giant fears, we can easily fall prey to what I call Grasshopper Syndrome. So Grasshopper Syndrome is when giant fear threatens our faith and someone becomes the grasshopper, either the giant or us, all dependent on where we fix our focus, whether it's on the giant or if it's on our giant God. It goes back to what I just said about the magnifying glass. If we take our magnifying glass and get super close to our problems and fears, studying and focusing on them, they get bigger. So when we magnify the object of our focus, eventually it will become what we glorify. So when we magnify the enormity of a giant, we see ourselves as grasshoppers. But there are two people who did not have a problem with grasshopper syndrome at all, and that's Joshua and Caleb. So Joshua and Caleb are Israelites, and the Israelites are God's chosen people, set apart by God so that he would be known to them and to the nations around them as the one true living God. Under the leadership of Moses and by many signs and wonders, the Lord delivers the Israelites after 400 years of slavery in Egypt. And God promises them a land of their own, a very good, plentiful land called the Promised Land. Well, a little more than a year into their journey, they are in the wilderness of Paran, and God tells Moses to send 12 spies into the Promised Land to scope it out. So Moses sends Joshua, Caleb, and 10 other men to spy the land. The whole nation of God's chosen people are right there on the cusp of walking into the Promised Land, a land flowing with milk and honey. I mean, they are right there. And so the spies depart, and they follow a very specific route that Moses lays out for them. And they're gone 40 days, and that's where we're going to pick up their story. So in Numbers 13:26, we see that they departed to the Promised Land, and they came back to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. In fact, the fruit of the land is so abundant and so over the top that one single cluster of grapes has to be suspended from a pole and carried between the shoulders of 2 of the spies. They also bring back pomegranates and figs. And as they stand before the children of Israel, evidence of the promises of God being true, dangling between their shoulders, they say in Numbers 13:27, "We went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit." So the land is just as God said that it would be. It is exceedingly good, and all the Israelites have to do is go and take it. But the spies have a but, and it changes everything. So they say in verses 28 and 29, "Nevertheless," we might say it like, "but the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the banks of the Jordan." So these cities, they're great. They're impenetrable. They're indestructible. The descendants of Anak were giant men with warlike features. Entire nations stand in their way. And with these words right here, the spies separate like oil and water into 2 very distinct groups. You have the terrified 10 who focus on the frightening and the impossible. And then you have the terrific 2, Caleb and Joshua, who only see the greatness and faithfulness of God. But even as the terrified 10 focus on the frightening and impossible, Caleb insists to them in verse 30, "Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it." But the terrified 10, well, they are terrified. And they insist in verse 31, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." And listen to this in verse 32. "And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, 'The land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature.'" Have you ever received a bad report that threw you into a tailspin of fear and devastation? I have. We can just turn on the news. We can open Facebook. We can check our text. We can check our email. Bad reports are all around us, telling us that the giants are too big for us. They can't be defeated. The enemy is too strong, and he's everywhere, devouring everyone. It happens all the time, and we need to be careful whose voices we listen to and what we let in, because who we listen to has a lot to do on what we focus on and what we magnify. So if we fill our ears and our heads with all manner of doom and gloom, people who bring bad reports, we can't be surprised when doom and gloom dominate our thoughts and our words and our hearts. As if the terrified 10 had not already said enough, they finish their recap with a humdinger and a whole heaping of drama, which, is that way of exaggerating something so extreme that it appears to be the most insurmountable or impressive thing ever, right? I have 3 girls, so I know drama, and I am a girl, so I know drama. So the terrified 10 in verse 33, they say, there we saw giants, the descendants of Anak, came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. So friends, right here on the pages of Scripture, we see Grasshopper Syndrome. So with their eyes on the enormity of the giants, they are grasshoppers in the giants' eyes, but they also see themselves as grasshoppers. Then they take their fear and they spread it among the people, because grasshoppers breed grasshoppers. And the congregation becomes what I call the crying crowd. And this is the majority who buys into the bad report and focuses on the giants. They weep and wail, perhaps with the backs of their hands planted on their foreheads in a big V for victim. And then in Numbers 14, 3-4, this is what they say. Why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? So they said to one another, let us select a leader and return to Egypt. So they take their eyes off of God and his greatness, and they embrace fear. The crying crowd feels sorry for their sorry circumstances and looks to what they know to regain a sense of comfort and security, even though what they know is slavery. What happens here with the Israelites is exactly what can happen with us. On one hand, we have God's promises, and on the other hand, we have the world's report, what is seen in the natural. And just like the Israelites, we can fall prey to believing in what we can only see in the natural as well. So we hear a scary report about something, and we cry and weep because we're overcome with fear and despair. We have another fight with our spouse or our kids. Someone we love makes another bad decision or is diagnosed with cancer. Politics, wars and rumors of wars, financial insecurity, unstable markets, layoffs and unemployment reports, and terrorist attacks and coronaviruses, etc., etc., etc. The reports are bad. Who wouldn't struggle with fear and uncertainty and be tempted to cry and weep? So we throw up our own V, right? And we cry, why, God? Why are you doing this to us? Why are you allowing this? Are you even there? Why would you bring me this far and let me face something so impossible? Just like the Israelites, we can also take our eyes off of God and his greatness and embrace fear, feeling sorry for our sorry circumstances and looking at what we know to regain a sense of security, even though what we know would return us to bondage. So the terrified 10 refuse to go into the land, but Caleb and Joshua refuse to give up. They don't see grasshoppers and giants. They see their great and mighty God. So listen to the words of the terrific 2 and let them be our call to magnify the name of the Lord, even in the land of our own giants, where we're grasshoppers in everyone's eyes, except God's. Jacob and Caleb speak to the entire congregation, and they say in Numbers 14, 7b-9, the land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. So who is the grasshopper now? It's a call to faith in the face of fear. It's a call to magnify the name of the Lord. And when we do, when our eyes are on God and how big he is, giants become grasshoppers that God will crush under his feet as he brings about his plan in our lives. We just have to stay focused on who he is and what he says he'll do and believe him, putting one foot in front of the other. When we choose to believe what he promises is true, we can choose to do what he shows us next. In faith, moving forward one step at a time. In obedience, just doing what he says. Taking the land even though it looks impossible. So go to the Lord in prayer. Magnify his name just like Jesus does. And then go ahead. Fear not the giants before you. Go ahead, Shauna. Write that book proposal and approach that publisher, even though the land is full of giants. Go ahead, friend. Start that ministry. Volunteer at that nonprofit. Take the lead in that area of need at church, even though the land is full of giants. Go ahead and start that business. Try that job. Change careers. Go for it. Go for the promotion, even though the land is full of giants. Go ahead and approach that person to be a friend or a mentor, even though the land is full of giants. Go ahead and take that next step toward the dream that God has put in your heart, even though the land is full of giants. Go ahead and stay in that marriage. Have that hard conversation. Confront the elephant in the living room. Forgive. Seek forgiveness. Move toward reconciliation with that loved one, even though the land is full of giants. The stakes are high because God will accomplish his plan with or without us. The Israelites still took the promised land, just not a single one who had cowered in unbelief. They took the side of fear and they lost the blessing of entering into the promised land. We see this in Numbers 14:36 through 37. Now the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land, who returned and made all the congregation complain against him by bringing a bad report of the land, those very men who brought the evil report about the land died by the plague before the Lord. God is still their God. They are still his people, but they don't get to step into the promised land. Of the spies, only Caleb and Joshua live. And ladies, this story right here, this is why the Israelites wander for 40 years in the wilderness. 1 year for every day that the spies were in the promised land, scoping it out. They were on the cusp of entering in, and they chose to fear the giants instead of moving forward in faith. When we shrink back from what we know God has for us to do because we're focused on the giants in our way, we lose. And this is exactly what the enemy wants. He cannot take away our salvation, but he can keep us from walking in God's promises. He wants us to see ourselves as grasshoppers in our giant's eyes as well as in our own eyes, because as long as we think we're the grasshopper, our fear of giants can overcome our faith in God. But when our focus is on the bigness of God, when we magnify his name, getting closer and closer to him with our magnifying glass, so that he gets larger and larger in our view. When we focus on his faithfulness to do exactly what he says, no matter what we see in the natural. When we focus on the truth of who he is and who he says we are in Christ, no matter what we see or feel in the natural, the giants that loom in the land become the grasshoppers. Our walk with God in prayer is going to involve lands with giants. It just is. But we don't have to be grasshoppers. Regardless of what we succumb to, fear or faith, God is still our God. But we have a choice to make. The Israelites make the wrong choice, and fear and complaining leave them wandering in the wilderness. If we want to move from fear to faith and into God's promises for us, one of the best ways that he makes available to us is to magnify his name. It's how the giants become the grasshoppers. So remember our main idea. What we magnify gets bigger. Let's add to that then. When we magnify the name of the Lord, giants become grasshoppers. I want to share with you the 10-2 rule for choosing faith when facing giant fear. Okay, the 10-2 rule for choosing faith when facing giant fear. So this is going to be 10 truths and 2 rules that we can keep before us to remind and equip us to choose faith when we face fear. This is actually on my blog at shaunawallace.com. If you just type in 10/2 in the search bar, it'll bring it up. That way, if you don't want to try and get all this down, you know you can find it there. So not only is this a way to choose faith, it's also a way to position ourselves to magnify the name of the Lord. So here are the 10 truths. Number 1, we live in a fallen world. There will always be an abundance of bad reports. Number 2, giants will always be part of our journey. What we focus on determines the grasshopper. Either we will be the grasshopper to our giants at risk of being squished, or the giants will be grasshoppers to our God. Number 3, the longer our gaze lingers on giants, the larger they loom. Number 4, who we listen to affects who we believe. So don't listen to the world. Listen to God. Number 5, know that the majority of people believe bad reports. It's really tempting to cower in fear rather than defy fear in faith. So, number 6, expect to be in the minority. We might stand alone when we stand in faith, but we are never alone. Joshua and Caleb were 2 of 12. That actually represents about 17%. But as they declared, let us also be the ones to declare to ourselves and others, the Lord is with us. Do not fear. Number 7, the promises of God don't change. Our choices affect the degree to which we experience them here on earth. Number 8, as humans, we may be inclined to favor the familiar and comfortable because faith is risky. Know it and resist it. Number 9, when God has a plan, he will bring it to pass no matter what the land or the giants look like. He's the one in charge, not all of them. And then number 10, our giant God crushes giants as if they're grasshoppers. So knowing these 10 truths, like knowing them in your knower, now we can follow these 2 rules or 2 steps. Number 1, set and keep your eyes on the grandness of God, believing his promises over the world's reports. Agree with God. Of himself, he declares in Jeremiah 32:27, behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is there anything too hard for me? This is a rhetorical question. The answer is no. There is nothing too hard for the Lord. And then number 2, move forward in faith no matter what, confronting your giants along the way. It's like David when he confronts and defies Goliath right before slaying him with a single stone from his slingshot and taking his head, we can declare to our giants just like he does. I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into my hands. The giants, they don't matter, really. Just our obedience to believe and in faith take the next step that God sets right before us. He has the plan all figured out, and he will open whatever doors are necessary for us to continue down the path that he's set before us, no matter how well the path lines up with the world's wisdom or not. Likely it won't. But in prayer, when we magnify the name of the Lord, his praise continually on our lips, we can navigate even the impossible. There will always be giants, because without giants, we don't need faith. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. So why in the world would he ever ask us to do anything that doesn't require faith? Choose faith, even in the face of giant fear. Hold up the magnifying glass close to his face, close to his character, his story, his word, his promises, and make him large. Before we say anything to the Father in prayer, we can turn our attention to his sacred holy name and declare how big he is. Just like Jesus does in Luke 11:2. It's the very first thing he prays and the very first thing he tells us to say every time you pray, Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. What we magnify gets bigger, so let us magnify the name of the Lord.